The first flakes began falling just after sunset, drifting through the orange glow of the streetlights in Pine Hollow, a quiet mountain town where winters came early and stayed too long. The temperature had already dropped below freezing, and most of the residents had shut their doors, leaving the streets empty except for the wind. On the edge of town stood a small wooden house with a crooked fence and smoke curling from its chimney. Inside, Evelyn Carter sat in her worn armchair knitting by the fireplace. She was 72, sharp-eyed, and known by everyone in town as Miss Evelyn. Her husband had passed years ago and her children lived out of state, but she never complained. She had her garden, her church group, and her faith. The radio crackled from the kitchen counter, warning of a snowstorm moving fast down from the mountains. "They expect heavy snowfall and strong winds through the night," the announcer said. "If you're on the road, pull over and stay put." Evelyn shook her head. "Every year someone tries to be brave in this weather," she murmured. She stood, walked to the window and peered out. The snow was thick now, swirling in waves. The road that ran past her house disappeared under a white curtain. For a while, all she could see was the blur of headlights in the distance. Then they vanished. A few minutes later, the sound of engines cut through the wind, deep, growling engines that didn't belong to cars. Evelyn frowned. "Lord have mercy, who's out on bikes in this mess?" The rumble grew louder, closer, until she could make out the shapes. A line of motorcycles crawling slowly down the snow-covered road, their headlights glowing weakly through the storm. 9 riders, all dressed in leather, fighting to keep their machines upright. They looked like shadows in the whiteout. As they neared her property, one of the bikes slid sideways, its tires losing traction. The rider managed to stop before falling, but the others quickly pulled over behind him. Within seconds, the engines went quiet, leaving only the sound of wind and the distant creak of pine trees. Evelyn's heart raced. She'd heard stories about biker gangs, rough men, troublemakers, some even dangerous, and from the patches on their jackets, she could tell exactly who they were. Hell's Angels. She stood frozen at her window, watching as the men dismounted, their breath fogging in the air. They looked lost and cold, huddling near the ditch beside the road. One of them kicked at his frozen tire. Another rubbed his hands together and looked toward her house. When the first man started walking up her driveway, her stomach tightened. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with snow clinging to his leather jacket and beard. His boots crunched in the snow as he approached her porch. He knocked at once firmly. Evelyn hesitated, her hand on the curtain. She could hear her own heartbeat. "Ma'am?" The voice was deep, steady, not threatening. "Sorry to bother you. We're stuck. Roads are iced over. Just need to warm up for a bit if that's okay." She didn't move at first. Every instinct told her to be cautious, but there was something in his tone, polite, almost weary. She opened the door just enough to see him clearly. His eyes met hers. They weren't wild or angry. "Just tired. There's 9 of us," he said. "We've been on the road since Denver. Didn't think the storm would hit this hard." Evelyn studied him for a moment, then looked past him toward the line of men standing in the snow. She could see their shoulders hunched, their clothes soaked through. They looked more human than dangerous in that moment. "You'll track snow all over my floors," she said finally. The man gave a small, relieved smile. "We'll take our boots off, Mom, promise." She opened the door wider. "Come in, then. One at a time. Leave the bikes where they are. They'll be fine." The men filed in slowly, stomping their boots at the doorstep, shaking off snow. The warmth from the fireplace hit them immediately, and for the first time since the storm began, some of them smiled. "Much obliged, ma'am," one said softly. "Didn't think anyone out here would open the door for us." Evelyn handed him a towel. "You look half frozen. Sit down before you fall down." They laughed quietly, the sound filling her small living room. It was a strange sight. 9 tattooed bikers crowding around a floral couch, their leather jackets dripping snow onto her rug. The tall man who had knocked removed his gloves and extended his hand. "Name's Jack. We were headed to a memorial ride for one of our brothers. Didn't mean to cause any trouble." Evelyn shook his hand firmly. "I'm Evelyn Carter. This is my home, and right now it's yours too. You'll stay until it's safe to leave." Jack looked surprised. "That's real kind of you, ma'am." She nodded toward the fireplace. "Kindness keeps you warmer than fear. Sit down and dry off. I'll make some coffee." While she bustled around the kitchen, the men settled in. They spoke in low tones, respectful of the quiet of her home. One of them, A younger man with a scar on his cheek stared at the family photos on the mantel. "Is that your husband?" he asked. Evelyn glanced up from the coffee pot. "Yes, George. He passed 12 years ago," the man nodded. "Looks like a good man." "He was," she said softly. "Hard-headed but good." When she returned with a tray of steaming mugs, the men thanked her, their rough voices softened by gratitude. She noticed their hands, calloused, cut, marked with ink, shaking as they held the warm cups. As the storm howled outside, time seemed to slow. She asked no questions about their past, and they didn't volunteer any. But slowly stories began to emerge. One man had lost his brother years ago in a crash. Another talked about rebuilding old bikes with his son. They spoke with the kind of honesty that only comes when people stop pretending to be tough. Evelyn listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally smiling. "Sounds like you've all been through a lot," she said. Jack looked at her thoughtfully. "We've seen our share, yeah. But I'll tell you something, ma'am. Nobody's ever opened their door to us before. Not like this. You look cold," she said simply. That's all that mattered. By midnight, the snow was nearly a foot deep. Evelyn spread blankets across the living room floor, insisting they stay the night. "The roads'll still be bad come morning," she said. "You're not going anywhere till that wind stops biting." They didn't argue. She checked the fire one last time, then turned to Jack. "You'll keep an eye on that wood for me?" "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "We'll take care of it." When she went to bed, she paused at her door, looking back at the sight of 9 bikers huddled under quilts, boots lined by the wall, their motorcycles buried in snow outside. She whispered a short prayer of thanks, not for safety, but for company. The storm raged through the night, covering Pine Hollow in silence and white. But inside that little wooden house, warmth and unlikely friendship took root, something that would last far longer than the storm itself. By morning, the world outside was buried under white. The wind had calmed, but the snow had piled high against the porch steps, turning Evelyn's yard into a frozen sea. When she opened the curtains, she could see the bikes nearly invisible under the drifts, just faint outlines of metal and chrome poking through. In the living room, the men were stirring awake, stretching stiff muscles and shaking off sleep. The fireplace had burned low, but the air was still warm. A few of them were already helping each other tidy up the blankets. Jack was the first to notice her. "Morning, Miss Evelyn," he said, his voice still rough from sleep. "Hope we didn't keep you up." "You kept that fire going," she said. "That's more than enough." She smiled when she saw one of them, the young man with the scar, carefully folding the quilts she'd given them. "You boys eat breakfast?" "Not yet," Jack said. "We figured we'd wait for you to wake up before touching anything." Evelyn shook her head. "That's polite but unnecessary. Your guests here." "Polite folks pour their own coffee when they're old enough to ride Harley-Davidsons." The men laughed softly, easing the stiffness of the morning. She moved toward the kitchen and started frying eggs, humming a gospel tune under her breath. Before long, the smell of breakfast filled the house. Eggs, grits, and biscuits warming in the oven. When she turned around, she found 2 of the bikers standing behind her, awkwardly holding plates. "We figured we'd help," one said. "You shouldn't have to do all this alone." She nodded, pretending not to notice how they fumbled with the utensils like schoolboys. "You can pour the juice, then. Don't spill. I just mopped last week." They followed her directions carefully, and soon everyone was gathered around the small wooden table. 9 big men sat shoulder to shoulder, careful with their plates, speaking quietly. It looked like something out of a painting, rough edges softened by the glow of morning light through frosted glass. Jack raised his mug. "To the kindest woman in Pine Hollow," he said. Evelyn laughed. "You don't know that. Maybe I'm the meanest one you've met yet." "Not possible," someone said, and they all chuckled. After breakfast, they bundled up and went outside to check the damage. The snow was waist-deep in some places. The bikes were completely covered, the engines frozen solid. "Looks like we're not going anywhere for a while," Jack said. Evelyn stood at the door, wrapped in a heavy shawl. "Then you might as well make yourselves useful." "My shed roof's been leaking all winter," Jack smiled. "Yes, ma'am. We can handle that." It took them less than an hour to form a plan. They shoveled a path to the shed, cleared off the snow, and began repairing the old roof with spare wood from the pile behind her house. Evelyn watched from the window, her heart swelling with a quiet gratitude she hadn't expected to feel. They worked like a family, teasing each other, shouting instructions, laughing through the cold. By midday, the shed roof was patched, her walkway was clear, and one of them had even fixed the crooked porch step that had squeaked for years. When they came back inside, their faces were red from the wind, their hands raw from the cold, but their spirits high. Evelyn handed each of them a bowl of hot stew and said, "You boys sure you're not running a construction company on the side?" One of them grinned. "We could start one if you're hiring." "You couldn't afford me," she said. The laughter filled her small kitchen again. As the afternoon faded, they started talking more openly. The storm had forced them to stop, to rest, and for once they didn't seem eager to get back on the road. Jack told her about the memorial ride, how they'd been heading north to honor an old friend who'd died in a crash years ago. "He was like a brother to us," Jack said quietly. "Used to say the road's the only thing that made sense to him. Guess we were all chasing that same piece." Evelyn listened carefully. "You find it?" Jack looked at her, thoughtful. "Maybe not yet, but this feels closer than most days do." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes peace finds you when you stop trying to earn it." That night the power went out. The whole house fell into darkness, and the only light came from the flickering fireplace. Evelyn started lighting candles, while the men gathered near the windows. The snow outside glowed faintly under the moonlight. "Feels like the world's gone quiet," one of them said softly. "It's just the snow," Evelyn replied. "It quiets everything. Makes people think clearer." Jack leaned forward, staring into the fire. "You ever get scared living out here alone?" "Not really," she said. "Fear doesn't do much good. Besides, I've got my faith, and this old house has seen worse storms than this one." He nodded, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "Still, you shouldn't have to handle all this alone. You ever need something, you call us." "You got that?" She chuckled. "And what would 9 bikers be doing answering a call from an old lady?" Jack smiled faintly. "Whatever she needs. You fed us, gave us shelter. That doesn't happen much in our world." Evelyn looked at the circle of faces around her, men she would have crossed the street to avoid a day ago. They were still rough, still scarred, but in that firelight they looked gentle. "You boys did just fine today," she said. "If kindness passes through your door, you don't ask what jacket it's wearing. You just let it in." No one spoke for a while after that. The fire crackled, the wind pressed softly against the windows, and for the first time that week every man in that room felt something they hadn't in a long time: home. By morning the storm had passed. The sun glinted off the snow like glass, and the air was sharp with cold. The roads were still slick, but the men decided to start clearing the way to their bikes. Evelyn stood on the porch with a mug of tea, watching them. "Don't you go sliding off that road," she called. Jack grinned up at her. "We'll take it slow." "Can't make promises about the sliding, though," she smiled. "You come back through this town again, you stop here." "I mean it," he nodded. "You can count on that." They spent another 2 hours digging out the bikes and checking the engines. When they were finally ready to leave, each man came up to her, shaking her hand or giving her a gentle hug. "You saved us out there," one said. "We don't forget things like that." Evelyn's eyes softened. "How you save yourselves every time you help someone else." When the last engine started, the sound filled the valley like thunder. She watched them ride away one by one, the black of their jackets cutting against the white of the snow. For a long while she stood there, waving until they disappeared into the trees. Then she went back inside, her heart strangely full, unaware that the promise Jack had made, the one about answering her call, was not just talk. It was a vow, and someday soon that vow would be tested. Spring came late that year in Pine Hollow. The last patches of snow melted into the soil by April, leaving muddy tracks along the roadside and fresh blooms in Evelyn's small front yard. Life settled back into its gentle rhythm, mornings with tea and gospel radio, afternoons tending to her flowers, evenings knitting by the fire she no longer needed for warmth. But every so often, she'd glance toward the bend in the road where the bikers had disappeared months earlier. Sometimes she'd imagine she heard the distant hum of engines again. Other times she'd smile to herself, wondering where life had taken them. Jack had given her a phone number before he left, scribbled on a folded napkin. "If you ever need anything." "Anything, you call that number," he'd said. She'd tucked it in her Bible without much thought. By May, the quiet life she'd known for decades began to shift. A new company had started construction just beyond town, clearing land that bordered her property. The workers were rough, loud, and careless. Trucks thundered up the dirt road all day, leaving tire ruts and dust across her fence. One afternoon, Evelyn went out to check her mailbox and found one of the contractors leaning on her fence post, smoking. He looked young, maybe in his 20s, wearing a hard hat and a neon vest. "You lost?" she asked, setting her mail under her arm. He grinned, not kindly. "No, ma'am. Just waiting on my crew," she frowned. "That's private property." "You can wait by the road." He took another drag of his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "It's just a fence, relax." Evelyn's tone stayed calm. "This fence was built by my husband 50 years ago. He'll show it some respect." The man shrugged and walked off, muttering something she didn't catch. She shook her head and went back inside. The next day she found tire tracks across her yard. 2 of her flower beds were crushed flat. The wooden border snapped. Her heart sank. She didn't have the strength to replant it all, and she knew it hadn't been an accident. That evening she called the construction office. The foreman apologized but didn't promise much. "Boys probably cut the turn too tight," he said. "We'll try to be more careful." "Try," she repeated, her voice firm. "You'll do better than that." The next morning it happened again, deeper tracks. Another section of fence damaged. By the end of the week, Evelyn stood on her porch, watching the crew pack up for the day, anger and helplessness swirling inside her. She was a woman who had handled life's storms with grace, but this one felt different. It wasn't weather. It was people. That night, as she turned down her bed, her eyes fell on her Bible resting on the nightstand. The folded napkin peeked out from between the pages. She hesitated, then opened it. Jack's handwriting was still there, bold, simple. "If you ever need anything." She stared at the number for a long moment, then sighed. "Lord, I hope I'm not doing something foolish," she murmured. She picked up the phone and dialed. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "Yeah? This is Evelyn Carter," she said. "I don't know if you remember, Miss Evelyn." The voice brightened immediately. "It's Jack. Of course I remember." "You okay?" She hesitated. "I'm fine. It's just, well, I've been having trouble with some folks tearing up my property. I tried fixing it, but it keeps happening." There was a short silence. When he spoke again, his tone was calm but firm. "We'll take care of it." "That's not why I called," she said quickly. "I just thought maybe you could—" "Miss Evelyn," he interrupted gently, "you helped us when nobody else would. You gave 9 men a place to stay when we couldn't even feel our hands. We don't forget things like that. You don't lift another finger. I'll be there soon." "Jack, I didn't mean—" But he'd already hung up. The next morning Evelyn went about her day as usual. She watered her flowers, swept the porch, and pretended she hadn't made that call. By late afternoon she began to doubt he'd even come. The sound of construction roared as usual down the road. Then, just as the sun began to set, the noise changed. It wasn't trucks this time. It was engines, deep, familiar ones. She stepped onto the porch and froze. 9 motorcycles rolled slowly down the road, their chrome catching the evening light. They stopped at the edge of her property, the same way they had months before. Jack swung his leg off his bike and walked up to the porch. He smiled when he saw her. "Told you we'd come if you called." Evelyn laughed, half in disbelief. "You boys ride halfway across the country for one old lady's fence?" Jack shrugged. "We ride where we're needed." The rest of the group joined him, nodding politely to her before looking toward the damaged yard. "That them?" one asked. Evelyn sighed. "They'll be back in the morning. I just wanted to talk to them, not scare anyone." Jack's eyes softened. "No one's scaring anybody. We'll just have a word." That night the sound of laughter came from her yard as the men set up camp near the porch. They grilled food over a small fire pit, repaired the broken fence with spare wood from their trucks, and patched her flower beds as carefully as if they were their own. Evelyn brought them lemonade and shook her head. "You're turning this place into a clubhouse," Jack smiled. "Could do worse." As the stars came out, the yard glowed softly from the fire. The men sat around it talking in low voices. Evelyn watched them through the window, her heart full in a way she couldn't explain. She didn't know what they planned for the morning, but she knew one thing. She wasn't alone anymore. When dawn came, the construction trucks rolled up the road again. This time the drivers slowed as soon as they saw 9 men in leather jackets standing by the fence, arms crossed, calm but unmistakably present. No words were exchanged. No threats were needed. The message was clear. By the end of the day, the noise faded. The trucks kept to their side of the road. The workers didn't linger near her property anymore. That evening, Jack knocked on her door again. "Problem solved," he said simply. Evelyn handed him a basket of cornbread. "You didn't have to scare anyone," he smiled. "Didn't have to. Just showed up," she laughed softly. "That's all it takes sometimes," he nodded. "You know, you reminded us that night when you opened your door that kindness still exists in this world. We figured it was time to return the favor." Evelyn looked at him warmly. "Then I guess we're even." Jack shook his head. "Not even close, ma'am. We're just getting started." They stayed another day, helping her mend the last bit of her yard, fixing her mailbox and oiling her porch hinges. When they finally left again, the sound of their engines carried through the valley like thunder rolling off the hills. Not loud, not wild, but protective. And this time, when Evelyn waved from her porch, she didn't wonder if she'd ever see them again. She knew she would, because promises made in a snowstorm last longer than most people realize. The years rolled on quietly in Pine Hollow. The seasons came and went as they always had, spring rain turning the soil dark and soft, summer bringing children's laughter through the valley, autumn painting the trees gold. Evelyn aged gracefully with each year, her hair whiter, her hands slower, but her spirit just as steady. Every so often, the low rumble of motorcycles would echo through the hills. The neighbors would peer through their curtains, but Evelyn never flinched. She knew that sound. She'd smile, set down her teacup, and go to the porch. Without fail, they came, sometimes just Jack, sometimes all nine. They never announced their visits. They didn't need to. They arrived quietly, like family stopping by on their way somewhere else. They brought supplies when storms hit, shoveled her driveway in winter, and fixed her roof after a heavy rainstorm. They called her Ma even though she never asked them to, and in time that name stuck. The town noticed. People began to whisper about the old woman up on the hill, the one with the bikers who came and went like watchful spirits. Some were curious, some judgmental, but no one ever bothered her. One autumn afternoon, Evelyn sat on her porch while Jack repaired the gate. He looked older now, grey in his beard, lines around his eyes, but his presence was as solid as ever. "You know," she said, rocking gently in her chair, "people in town still don't quite know what to make of you boys." Jack smiled. "That's all right. We're not here for them." "I know," she said. "You're here because of a storm that feels like a lifetime ago." He nodded. 9 men were freezing to death on a road nobody cared about. Then some woman opened her door and gave us warmth, food, and more respect than we'd had in years. That kind of thing sticks with you." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I didn't do anything special." He set his hammer down and looked at her. "You did something we didn't think people like you ever would. You saw us." The breeze moved through the trees, scattering a few leaves across the porch. She thought about that night, how scared she had been at first, how her hand had trembled on the doorknob. She realized now how close she'd come to turning them away. "Funny thing," she said softly. "I used to pray for protection out here all by myself. Guess the Lord has a sense of humor." Jack laughed quietly. "Guess he does." As the years passed, their visits became part of the rhythm of her life. They'd come through every few months, sometimes bringing their families. The children would play in her yard, while the men fixed whatever needed fixing. She'd cook big meals and tell stories at the table while everyone listened. When one of them fell ill, she sent letters. When another had a baby, they sent her photos. She kept them all in a shoebox by her bed. Pictures of rough men smiling beside their motorcycles, holding babies, standing in front of her little wooden house, with their arms around her shoulders. By the time Evelyn turned 80, the town no longer whispered about the bikers. They waved when they rode through. The grocery clerk started setting aside supplies for them when he saw their jackets. Pine Hollow had learned something too. Kindness could change the shape of a place. One cold February morning, Jack arrived alone. His expression was quiet but heavy, the way someone looks when carrying more than words can hold. Evelyn was sitting by the fire, a blanket over her knees. "Where are the others?" she asked. He sat across from her. "Scattered." Some moved away. "One passed last winter." She nodded, sadness flickering across her face. "That's life." "The road only goes one way." He smiled gently. "Still we talk. Every Christmas, every ride. They always ask about you, always." Her eyes softened. "Tell them I'm still here." Tell them I'm proud, he nodded. You know, we got a rule now. New members in the chapter. We tell them your story. About the night 9 men were saved by a woman who didn't care what patch was on their back. We call it the Carter Rule. Means you don't judge help. You just give it. Evelyn felt tears press behind her eyes, though she smiled. That's not my doing, Jack, that's yours, he shook his head. You lit the fire. We just kept it going. A long silence filled the room, not empty but full. The kind of silence that only exists between people who understand each other without needing to speak. When Jack finally stood to leave, she took his hand. You've done right in this world, she said. You all have, he nodded once. Because of you. The next spring came gentle and green. Flowers bloomed again along the fence, and the air smelled of pine and rain. But that year the motorcycles didn't come. Evelyn's health began to fade. The doctor visited often, the neighbors checked in, but she was at peace. She sat by the window most afternoons, watching the road that curved past her home. Sometimes she thought she heard engines in the distance, and she would smile. Certain they'd come back one last time, they did. The day she passed, the sound of engines filled Pine Hollow again, 9 motorcycles riding slow, their headlights cutting through the morning mist. The townspeople stood silently as the men rode up to her house. They dismounted without a word, removed their caps and stood in a line on her front lawn. Jack placed a single red rose on her porch rail. You kept us alive, he said quietly. Now we'll keep you remembered. In the months that followed, they returned often, maintaining her house, keeping her garden alive, repainting the fence every spring. They never let it fall into ruin, and when new people moved into town, they were told a story about an old woman who opened her door one winter night to 9 bikers in a snowstorm, and how they spent the rest of their lives making sure no harm ever touched her again. It wasn't about loyalty or reputation. It was about gratitude, the kind that grows from one act of kindness and spreads farther than anyone could imagine. And every time the wind carried the sound of engines through the valley, Pine Hollow remembered.